This is me, and that is a house that is currently feeding on my fear until my heart stops. Hi, I have weird dreams that often turn into straight-up fantasy novels. I'm going to tell you about this borderline nightmarish one in this video. You should stay till the end. This dream has a pretty crazy twist. In this dream, I was once again a young man. It's kind of a recurring theme. My name was Robin, and I had longish brown hair and a white peasant shirt and brown pants. I was barefoot and rather slender and not very tall. This dream meshed together from a lot of weird origins. The first memory I can grasp is the sight of the house. It wasn't normal. It looked like a steampunk, old-fashioned type mansion, sat in a rather large clearing in a dense forest. It was huge, nearly 2 to 3 stories in height, maybe more, but the size didn't matter. The inside was never-ending, bigger than the deceitful outside appearance. The house looked to be made of rotting wood and endless twisting pipes of rusted metal. Holes made from broken boards were darkened by shadows too deep to be considered natural. From the gaps between the boards and the pipes peered yellow, blinking eyes with black pupils. They were unnatural, hundreds of them, bright and staring and vanishing the moment you got too close. Always watching, always following you, they never went away, and they stared from every crevice and dark place, from every shadow and crack. The house was alive, I'm sure of it now. Some things you just know in a dream, like memories you didn't make but were given to you by whatever character you now inhabited. Somehow I knew this house had consumed victims, hundreds of them before me, and I knew it would consume thousands after it was through with me. Not much noise came from the house itself. It was silent and deathly. However, I have blurred memories of screaming coming from inside as I approached to enter it. Now, why would I ever enter this horrid place? This terrifying creature or thing that screamed danger and harm? Well, I'll get to that in a bit. As I mentioned before, the inside of this house was deceitfully huge, a never-ending mess of hallways and small rooms and cracks in the walls that would let you through, only to land you in the middle of another hallway sequence. Like Maze Runner, every time you left the house or turned your back, it could change. Entering it was a death wish, and escaping was nigh impossible. The walls ran with the same pipes as the outside, and the same rotting wood lined the floors. Some holes were large enough to crawl through, and I'd be forced to enter them to try and find my way out. I'm not even sure the house had a proper front door. I think I squeezed through a large, thin gap of broken planks, and they splintered and scraped my body and hands as I passed. Eyes watched my every move as I passed through, staring in silence. The house watched me as I traversed through it, plotting ahead with traps to ensnare me. But normal traps wouldn't do. Oh no. These eyes seemed to peer into the mind, and rake through my very thoughts, and find my most hidden fears and my darkest memories. Each trap was never the same as the last. Each one catered to my nightmares. Sudden darkness here, a skull found there, noises and smells and walls that closed in, as pipes writhed and came alive along the walls like serpents. All of it happened, directed perfectly to make me lock up, make my heart rip itself in two as it pounded and raced. My hands and feet all but bled as I fled from hall to hall, from one cramped opening to the next. Snakes appeared through holes and snapped and hissed, and darkness surrounding the eyes turned into millions of spiders that would spread, crawled all over me. The house showed no mercy, and it did not relent even as I screamed for it to be over. I barely made it out alive every time I entered. The only reason why I managed to make it was that I became numb. The house would find a new slew of fears and throw variations at me until it didn't receive such a large reaction. I knew that the house would do this. I knew it would eventually run dry and I'd be able to make my escape after days of torture. But each time I was forced to go back to it, I knew it would find still more. It would rip away things even I didn't know I feared. And again, it would have its fun. Again, it would feed on the fear, bleed me dry, until I had no more energy to be afraid. Now, once more you might ask, why in the heck would I ever go back in? Why would I not run? Well, you see, I wasn't entering willingly. A man was forcing me back over and over, and his name was Warren. I distinctly remember. He was a towering, built man with a beard and furred clothing at the shoulders, and he carried an axe. He had a helper, a man who'd stood guard before the house, and informed him whenever someone managed to escape its clutches. His name was Stephen, and he wielded a crossbow. Inside the house grew these sad, wilted-looking plants, peeking up from pipes and boards in little rooms that choked sunlight peered into. These plants, Warren said, were valuable, but he never said why. I figured they were medicinal, and that I was doing good in fetching them. There was a slum surrounding the house, built on the clear land around the haunted place. Poor, wretched people lived there, with collapsing houses and pieces of metal for roofs. Mostly the widows and children lived there, dressed in rags and looking broken and haunted and lost. I justified my never-ending trips into the house as helping the man, Warren, get herbs for these poor souls that had lost family that entered the house. I understood I was the only one who had survived upwards of 4 trips inside this house. I was somehow the only one who could do it, but every time I escaped and lay before the house, writhing and realizing I was out again, Warren seemed to get only more impatient. With each escape, I would beg for rest, to not go back, for I knew the house would adapt again, and each time he would get shorter with me. First, he would gently convince, then he would order, then he would force. Every time I would approach him and beg, he would find another excuse to send me back, as though he wanted each trip to be my last. I had danced with death too many times at one point, and for that I paid very dearly. The 5th time I entered the house, I was locked inside for months. What used to be a week of begging and running and searching and hiding became a blur of wretched fear. For nearly 2 months, I was locked away, unable to escape, for the house had found new fears to abuse, new blood to feed upon. It didn't want flesh, it wanted to listen to my heart beat itself into exhaustion, wanted to feel the terror in my movements and hear it in my voice. Every place I found to crawl into and huddle up for a break would be twisted into some new torment. No rest, no place to lay, no one coming to my aid. Until I found a gap in the outer walls and forced my body through it. It was bright out, and a gentle breeze touched my filthy skin. It was such a strange sensation after so long with nothing but stale air that smelt of rust and sawdust and death. I could even feel the grass gently prickling along my bare arms and lower legs. I scrambled up, my hands full of the coveted plants Warren wanted so badly, and I brought them to him in his shelter. The shelter was like a half house, half tent. Colorful rugs and cloth made up some of the roof coverings. They were red and purple. The rest was made of dark wood. It sat not 200 feet from the front of the house, always watching. Warren seemed surprised and disappointed to see me, even as I gave him the plants I had held through months of torture and pain. In my shaking voice, raspy from the never-ending screaming, I told Warren I was not going back in the house. I was done. I couldn't go back. Too many times I had been in its clutches, and the next time I entered I would surely die. The house had found so much. A new well of terrors, and it had gotten rougher, more merciless, working harder than ever to rip fear from my body after I had grown numb to so much. Hearing this, Warren's eyes seemed to blaze with anger, and I remember stating again that I was done. Please let me be on my way. But Warren was not done with me. His hands were far bigger than mine, and they now shot out at me, grabbing the back of my shirt as he passed by. I was jerked off my feet, weak as I was from the house, and he began to drag me towards that abomination of a mansion. I realized what he was doing as he neared it, and I began to twist and kick, begging, pleading, just anything. This house would kill me. It would kill me. One more trip would be straight into death's arms. Stephen, Warren's guard, watched as his boss jerked open a small section of boards and threw me inside, shutting it. The place he'd shoved me was tiny, with white walls that had a fleshy texture. The top nearly touched my head, and my knees were all but forced up near my chest. In the left upper corner was a beating heart. Just an FYI, I hate the sounds of beating hearts. This heart was the same sickly gray-white as the walls, and pale blue and gray veins ran from it into the walls, all over. It was bloodless, beating loudly, drowning out my thoughts. Then the box began to move. Even as I tried to press myself farther away from the pulsating veins and the organ that was just convulsing and beating, I was all but thrown at it. The box was like an elevator, but it went side to side, up and down, at neck-breaking speeds. I was thrown against the walls and toward the heart, endlessly bruising my head, neck, and body with the force of each directional change. Eventually, I used my elbow to rip open one of the flesh-like walls, slamming it. It splintered like wood, and I tumbled out into the same old halls, gasping and writhing and shaking. I believe I began to realize that, when I managed to fight back instead of cower or run, I would get out quicker. I interrupted the house's next torment before it was over. I'd never done that before. I eventually ran down a few more halls, found a gap that led outside, and forced myself through into sunlight again. I hit the grass and just lay there for a second, catching my breath. I heard a footstep and my head jerked up, and I made eye contact with Stephen, the guy who patrolled around and would tell Warren when people made it outside. Still breathless, I whispered his name. Stephen, please. Please don't tell Warren, please let me go. But Stephen only sighed, shook his head, and apologized. He then looked over his shoulder and shouted, Warren, Robin's out. Then Warren turned and started heading towards us. After that, I didn't wait a second longer, and I bolted up to my feet, tearing away towards the slum. I nearly tripped several times, using my hands to crawl until I was upright again. The dirt road was rough on my already bruised feet, and the dust was choking, suffocating. I darted through alleys between old, dilapidated buildings and past beggars and sorrowful widows and little children. Arrows from Stephen's crossbow hissed past me and sank with like a dull thunk into wood. Dodging arrows and ducking about, I noticed one of the larger shelters, likely constructed as aid for the broken people living near the evil house, waiting for their loved ones to escape, likely sent in by Warren. I stumbled towards it, hands reaching out and grasping an iron railing to a set of stairs. I remember the railing being warm, this warm iron feeling. If I could just climb up there and into a room, I could find shelter. But then, right behind me, Stephen slid around a corner, raised his crossbow, and the string snapped forward, and an arrow sunk into the back of my calf. I collapsed right at the base of the rickety, thin staircase, hands grasping at my leg, and I remember feeling that piercing pain of the arrow just deep inside the muscle. I could see Stephen approaching, reloading his crossbow, and Warren passed him up, having followed him. His murderous gaze was on me, and his axe was at the ready, and there was terrifying purpose in his steps. I was not going to perish by the house, that was for sure. I was cornered, breathless, wounded, backed against the wooden wall of a shelter, and trapped at the base of a staircase I could no longer climb. I looked back and I could feel my heart racing again, my breaths rapid and too shallow. As Warren approached, a tiny child with dirty blonde hair, specifically I remember he had dirty blonde hair, and he was dressed in a really, really big gray shirt, all patched and dirty. He was huddled against a barrel near where I was cornered. Warren paused and glanced at the child, who spoke quietly. "You killed my mom." Warren's cruel reply is just forever burned into my memory. He all but laughed in the child's face. That I did, and I cannot wait to watch the house consume her body. He brushed the child aside and continued to approach where I lay. Slightly behind him, Stephen spoke up again. It is burned into my memory. "Do you truly only punish criminals?" Warren didn't honor his inquiry with an answer. Instead, he stood over my body as I gasped and tried to crawl away, so terrified that I nearly began to beg, willing to do anything than go back into that house. And there, the dream ended. I kinda hoped Stephen shot the man, to be honest, and threw him into the house. I fully believe Warren was feeding that house and took delight in knowing just how many people would suffer before their hearts beat themselves to death. But we'll never know. I hope you all enjoyed this fresh dream. It really isn't very fresh. It was like a year ago, probably. I might sneak a different video in during the series, but so far I've really loved reliving these terrors, remembering new bits about them and putting in as much detail as I can recall, and tell me what you think. These videos are pretty high effort. Drop a like and a sub if you're interested in hearing more of these insane nighttime adventures.